And see here, and we've got folks coming in here. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the HMSC Research Seminar. My name is Yi-Chung Chung. I'm the Academic Program Manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon. And I, along with Angie Shremba, will be your co-hosts of today's talk. Some just basic logistics. We would like everyone's mics, cameras, and screen share off, and we ask that you keep them off for the event. Please ask any questions you might have using the chat box found at the bottom or the top of your Zoom screen at any time, and we'll answer any questions at the end of this talk. We'll be recording this event and we'll be posting in a few days on the HMSC websites under the past seminar page, as well as on our YouTube site. Some quick announcements. There will be no seminar next week on June 17th as we transition into the summer term, but join us the following week on June 24th when Brian Wells from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center will be talking about process studies to quantify ecosystem dynamics in the California current. If you need more info or the links to our upcoming events, check out our HMSC homepage, and you can scroll down to the bottom for more details at hmsc.oregonstate.edu. Yeah, put that in there. So today's speaker was invited by Angie Shremba, Assistant Professor of Senior Research at the Cooperative Institute for Marine Resource Studies at Oregon State University. So I'm going to hand it off to her to introduce today's speaker. Angie?
Thanks, Yi-Chung. I am pleased to introduce our seminar speaker for today, Dr. Aimée Lang. Aimée is a research scientist working with the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division at Southwest Fisheries Science Center. Aimée also serves as a convener for the International Whaling Commission by leading their stock definition and DNA working group. I've known Aimée for the past 10 years as she's been working on improving our understanding of blue whale taxonomy using genetic markers. However, Aimée completed her PhD working using genetic markers to better understand population structures of gray whale in the North Pacific, and she'll be talking to us more about that today. So with that, Aimée, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Angie, and thanks to everyone for having me here today to speak. I'm excited to talk a little bit about some of the research we've done on gray whales in the North Pacific using genetics. And so before I get started, I just wanted to quickly recognize the contributors to a lot of this work. This work depends on having samples from across the North Pacific, a lot of different types of analyses and lab work and all sorts of things. So I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that none of this would have been possible without all the work of the people listed on this slide and their contributions. And so I'm going to first start by just giving some fairly brief background on gray whale distribution and threats. And then I'm going to touch very briefly on our conservation and management mandates at NOAA Fisheries and for the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division there. And then I'll move into what we've learned about gray whales from genetic analyses, and then talk a little bit about what are the remaining questions and some of our plans for the future. So gray whales were historically found in the North Atlantic, but that population went extinct in the 1700s. And so the current distribution of gray whales is limited to the North Pacific, where they're found on both the eastern and the western margins. Within this ocean basin, the majority of gray whales feed during summer months up in the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas, which we refer to as the northern feeding ground. These whales migrate down the coast of North America to wintering grounds in the lagoons and coastal waters of Baja, Mexico. And these whales are considered part of the eastern North Pacific stock of gray whales. So gray whales across the North Pacific were greatly depleted by commercial whaling, but commercial whaling of eastern North Pacific whales ceased in the 1940s due to an international ban. And following this protection, the size of the eastern North Pacific gray whale population began to increase. And they were removed from the endangered species list in 1994. And they were actually the first marine mammal to be removed from the endangered species list. Subsequent to that, gray whales have undergone two what we call UMEs. That stands for unusual mortality events. The first of these happened in 1999 and 2000, and the second began in 2019 and is ongoing at present. We don't know exactly what causes these UMEs, but they're diagnosed essentially by an increased number of strandings along the US West Coast, as well as down in Mexico and up in the Bering and Chukchi Seas. We think that these UMEs are related to the fact that gray whales that feed up on that northern feeding ground are very close, the numbers are very close to the carrying capacity that environment can support. And so that periodically the abundance of the whales increases past the point where that environment can sustain their feeding, and that we have these increased levels of mortality. But that's based in part just on the fact that a lot of the whales that we do see stranded are emaciated or in poor body condition. So we don't know for sure exactly what mechanism is at work there. We can see the impacts of that most recent UME on the abundance. The most recent abundance estimate for the Eastern North Pacific gray whales was just recently published. It's about 20,600 animals. And you can see that that's quite a big drop from the previous estimate, which was before the UME started around 2015. So it's about a 25% drop since that time. Now, although most of the whales that are part of the Eastern North Pacific stock feed on that northern feeding ground, there's a small number that feed between Northern California and British Columbia. And we call that area the Southern Feeding Ground, or as I'll get to in a minute, the Pacific Coast Feeding Group Feeding Ground. And these whales, we think also, from what we know, also migrate down to the wintering grounds off Mexico. And there's some really excellent long-term photo identification work that's gone on to study these whales on the southern feeding ground. And from those studies, we know that animals using that area are comprised of two different groups. So the first group includes individuals which are sighted only during one season and are essentially thought to be stragglers from the migration. So maybe whales that weren't in good enough condition to make it all the way up into the Arctic and just stopped in this area to feed for that one season and don't necessarily return. The second group includes individuals which show intra and inter-seasonal site fidelity to the feeding ground. And these are the whales that we refer to as the Pacific Coast Feeding Group, or PCFG. Some of these whales have been sighted in the area for up to a couple of decades. The most recent abundance estimate for this group is about 230 individuals. And that does include some animals which were first identified as calves brought to the area by their mothers, and which have subsequently been seen to return to this area. And I know that there are, I'm just going to talk about the genetics today, but I know that there's a lot of work going on with the Pacific Coast Feeding Group whales, actually here at OSU with Dr. Torres's lab. So there's a lot of interest in this group of whales, and they are very local to that area. So the story that we saw in the Western North Pacific is really quite different from what we saw in the Eastern North Pacific. So whaling records indicate that gray whales were found in the summer months pretty much throughout the Okhotsk Sea in the Western North Pacific, as well as off the coast of Kamchatka. Historically, they used three different migratory pathways, one along the coast of the Korean Peninsula and then off both sides of Japan, so the Pacific side of Japan as well as the Sea of Japan side. And we don't know the specific location of the wintering grounds for this group of animals, although they are thought to be in the vicinity of the South China Sea. And that's at least in part from drawing parallels with where the location of the Eastern North Pacific wintering grounds are. So commercial whaling in the Western North Pacific continued through at least 1966 to the point where very few whales remained. And you can see in this table to the side, which only extends through 1935, it shows the total catches by year. Essentially by 1930s, these whales were commercially extinct in the Western North Pacific. And they were declared probably extinct in 1974 by Bowen. However, in the late 1970s and 80s, there were a small number of sightings, most of which were off the coast of Russia, of gray whales. And that led to eventually detecting a group of gray whales that was feeding off the northeastern coast of Sakhalin Island, Russia. And in 1995, a joint Russia-US research program was initiated to study those whales feeding off Sakhalin Island. That program does continue to date, although now it is run exclusively by our Russian colleagues. And we've really gleaned a wealth of information from this study. You know, it's now been going on for over 2 decades. We know that the number of animals feeding in that area is small. When the study started in the mid-1990s, it was quite a bit less than 100 animals. Now we're up to about 190 individuals that feed in that area. Those individuals show high levels of seasonal site fidelity and annual return to that area. And that includes quite a number of animals which were first identified as calves brought to the area by their mothers. And those calves, you know, have subsequently returned. And in fact, we've in some cases already seen some of the female calves return with their own calves. There are relatively few new animals identified each year. So we don't see a lot of new animals aside from those the first year calves. Currently, there are 54 known reproductive females that feed in this area. This number is up quite substantially from the early days when there were, you know, fewer than 10 initially. The population has increased over time, but at a relatively low rate of about 4%. And it was initially listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. I think that was in 2002, but it was recently reclassified as endangered because there are now a larger number of known reproductive females. So although it is a small population, it has shown you know, positive signs of the last couple of decades. So when this group of whales that feeds off Sakhalin was first discovered in the mid-1990s, we just generally assumed that these animals were a remnant population of the gray whales that were historically hunted off the coast of Korea. And again, that wintered in the Western North Pacific, although we didn't know exactly where they did overwinter. But because there was a lot of concern for the population, it was small, and we didn't know the location of those wintering grounds, there was a lot of interest in getting satellite tags on some of these Sakhalin whales with the hope of figuring out where that wintering ground was in the Western North Pacific. And eventually those efforts pulled together, and in 2010, OSU's Bruce Mate and some of his colleagues headed over to Sakhalin to do some satellite tagging, and they were successful in tagging a whale we had named Flex. This was at that time a 13-year-old male that was feeding off the coast of Sakhalin Island. And so they got the tag on, and I think everyone was just sort of waiting with bated breath to know where in the Western North Pacific Flex was going to go for the winter. And he surprised most people by not heading south at all, but instead heading east over to Kamchatka, and then across the Bering Sea, across the Gulf of Alaska until he reached the coast of Oregon, where he lost his tag while he was migrating south. And so this really kind of shook up our understanding of gray whales. It surprised a lot of people. I do think initially the reaction was, you know, hey, maybe there's this animal isn't indicative of most of the Sakhalin animals. We just happened to tag one animal that was from the Eastern North Pacific and returned to that area. However, Bruce went back the next year, and he was able to tag 2 additional gray whales off Sakhalin, and both of those animals also headed east across the North Pacific. And one of them actually maintained its tag all the way from Sakhalin to Mexico, and then all the way back up to Sakhalin. So a full migratory cycle, which was pretty amazing journey to be able to track. And that information from the tagging really spawned some concerted efforts to compare the Sakhalin photo ID catalog with the existing photo ID catalogs for other areas of the Eastern North Pacific. And so the most recent update from that, we have 53 whales, which we know have fed off of Sakhalin Island, but have also been photographed or genetically sampled or tagged. Or we know from tagging that they have used Eastern North Pacific migratory routes and Eastern North Pacific or the Eastern North Pacific wintering ground. So that's not an insubstantial portion of this small group of animals feeding off Sakhalin, and it's of note that the number is actually probably quite a bit higher. You can imagine even if all 200 of those Sakhalin whales were migrating to the Eastern North Pacific, once they get Off the coast of Alaska, they're intermixed in with 20,000 northern feeding ground whales, and would be pretty low probability of actually getting a photograph or a sample of them. So it's probably a number even higher than 53. But at the same time, there also continue to be records of gray whales off Japan and China. So over the last 2 decades, there have been 22 records of gray whales off Japan, most of those from the Pacific coast side, but some from the Sea of Japan. 2 of those animals are animals that we know were first identified as calves brought to Sakhalin by their mothers. And one of those calves has now completed a round trip so that it was sighted off Sakhalin and then Japan, and then Sakhalin and then Japan again, indicating some degree of fidelity to this migratory path. So this really just, the fact that we have some whales that we know are going over to the eastern North Pacific. We also have these records of whales off of Japan. Most of those are during the time period when we'd expect whales to be migrating south and north. It just really highlights how complex population structure is in gray whales. We went from thinking we had a very sort of simple situation where there was one group of animals that all stayed on the eastern North Pacific and one that all stayed in the western North Pacific. And now we know that the actual population structure is a lot more complicated than that. That really highlights the fact that we need to learn more about the movements of these animals and between these different areas. And I think perhaps particularly of note, we know that we have one area that's used by a really large number of animals, over 20,000, and then 2 areas that are used by quite smaller numbers of animals, 200 or so animals. So the animals are not distributed kind of equally across their range. And that is kind of further highlighted by the way that the threats are distributed. So the threats are also not distributed equally across the range. And in particular, there are some pretty significant anthropogenic threats to gray whales in the western North Pacific. And probably the most significant of these is entanglement and entrapment in fishing gear. Between 2005 and 2007, we had 4 female gray whales entrapped and killed in set nets off Japan. So that was a really disturbing trend. We haven't seen those sorts of numbers since then, at least they haven't been reported. Although there have been some continuing entanglements of gray whales, just not in those high numbers. So we know that's a concern. And then more recently, we had a whale that was observed entangled in gear from a coastal salmon trap net off of Sakhalin. And after being observed entangled, as far as I'm aware, that whale has not been sighted again. So that kind of highlighted another threat on the feeding ground off Sakhalin. And then finally, there's the real impetus for starting the project to study the whales off Sakhalin was, at least in part, to monitor the whales in the face of the oil and gas industry's interest in developing that area. And that oil and gas industry off Sakhalin Island continues to expand. And I think would actually, if I were to go back today, I would be sort of horrified at the level of activity that's there. So that's another potential threat to the western gray whales that feed off Sakhalin. And then there's kind of a specific case within the eastern North Pacific in that in 1995, the Makah Indian tribe of Northwest Washington expressed an interest in resuming their subsistence harvest of gray whales. And they, in order to do that, they've requested a waiver of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And it's of note that the Makah tribe did voluntarily stop taking gray whales for their subsistence hunt in the 1920s when the numbers were of gray whales in the eastern North Pacific were really low. And it was only after the gray whales were removed from the endangered species list that they expressed their interest in resuming that hunt. They did, in fact, take an animal legally in 1999, but since that time, they've been prevented from legal hunting of gray whales by litigation, essentially. So evaluation of the waiver request has been a big focus for NOAA in recent years, and it's led to the development of a proposed hunt plan that does include restrictions to limit the chance of taking PCFG in western North Pacific whales. The waiver request was evaluated at an administrative law judge hearing in October of 2019, And we're currently awaiting the judge's decision as to whether or not he's going to approve or support that waiver request. But really, essentially, whether that waiver request is approved or not, I think there will continue to be a need to better understand the stock structure of gray whales and what the potential implications of a hunt on gray whales in that area could be. And I should have mentioned earlier, but the reason this is a particular concern is that the macaw usual and accustomed hunting grounds are located at the very tip of northern Washington, but right in the middle of that Pacific Coast Feeding Group feeding ground. So we know that there's a chance that such a hunt could result in the taking of a PCFG whale. And then, of course, once we had the information about the animals from Sakhalin traveling to the eastern North Pacific, there's also some very small chance that an animal from the western North Pacific could be taken. So that's part of why this this process of getting a waiver request has been so complicated, because there are so many groups of animals that are using that area and need to be considered. So just briefly, I wanted to touch on kind of the main mandates that drive the work we do at NOAA Fisheries and our interest in learning more about gray whales and gray whale stock structure. So there are two primary mandates that the Marine Mammal and Turtle Division deals with through NOAA Fisheries. The first of these is the Marine Mammal Protection Act, or the MMPA, and the second is the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. And both of these are administered jointly by NIMS and also by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Basically, NIMS has responsibility for most marine mammals, but Fish and Wildlife are responsible for polar bears, manatees, otters, and walrus. And so the objective of the Marine Mammal Protection Act is to ensure that marine mammals remain functional elements of the ecosystem throughout their range. And so this mandate really is focused more on short-term management and conservation of marine mammals. So over the next several decades, kind of ecological timescales. And the unit to conserve under the Marine Mammal Protection Act is the demographically independent population, which is defined as a group whose population dynamics are more a consequence of births or deaths within the group rather than immigration and emigration. And that definition can be found in our guidelines for assessing marine mammal stocks. Basically, understanding the magnitude of potential threats to maintaining animals as functional elements of the ecosystem really requires a understanding of the level of connectivity or isolation that exists between regions. So if you have animals in one area and animals in another area, it's important to understand how connected they are to be able to understand the magnitude of potential threats. So basically, if human-induced mortality is concentrated in an area that's used by a small and relatively isolated group of animals, you can get localized depletion of animals in that area. And then the converse would be, if human-induced mortality is concentrated in an area used by a small group of animals that has high connectivity with another area that has a large number of animals, then you can imagine that if one animal is taken from that smaller area, then another animal will just immigrate into the area from the larger region. So that's kind of what drives our focus on demographically independent populations. And then the objective of the Endangered Species Act is a little bit more long-term, and it's to maintain the evolutionary potential of the species to adapt to changing conditions. So this is focused on, making sure that into the future, species can adapt to climate change, environmental changes, and so forth. And the unit to conserve under the ESA is the Distinct Population Segment, or DPS. It's a little bit more complicated to define, so I'm not going to go into the details there. But I would say that the ESA is focused on maintaining genetic diversity, and that really depends on, at least in part, on how many animals are interbreeding. So if you think about large evolutionary timescales, large groups of interbreeding individuals are going to be able to maintain high diversity, which means they'll have a better chance of adapting to changing conditions in the future, whereas a small group, or a group that remains small for a long period of time, will tend to have low diversity and thus a low capacity to adapt to environmental changes. And so with gray whales, with these two mandates, I think we're really kind of looking at under the MMPA, do animals move between area? And if so, how many of them are moving and how regularly are they moving? So, because that's what gets at whether or not a group of animals is demographically independent. It's how much immigration into that group is occurring. And then under the ESA, one of the main questions of interest is how many animals are interbreeding with each other, so that we have an idea of what the capacity of those animals is to maintain adaptive diversity into the future. So now I'll just move into what we've learned from genetics. And I would say that there's a lot of other different types of studies and different lines of evidence that do go into our work with the MMPA and the ESA, but genetics is really focused on looking at those units to conserve, and in some ways is kind of the baseline for helping those two mandates move forward. And of course, to do genetics, we need to collect sufficient samples. And we've been really fortunate with gray whales to work with a lot of collaborators that have been willing to contribute samples from across the North Pacific to our collection and for use in our study. And that's really been invaluable to making this work happen. We currently have samples collected from 156 individuals known to feed off Sakhalin. And those samples were collected between 1995 and 2011. Between 1995 and 2007, we had our most concentrated sampling effort. And at that time, we had 83% of all animals photographically identified were genetically sampled, which was a really impressive data set. Our ability to collect biopsies in that area hasn't been as easy in subsequent years, but we've still managed to collect a few here and there. And all except for one of these biopsies is associated with a photographically identified individual, and thus a sighting history for that individual off of Sakhalin and now potentially in other areas. We're probably doing the worst really in the northern feeding ground. We have 106 individuals sampled from that area, which is not an insignificant sample size, but is a fairly small proportion of the number of animals that are using that area. And then for the work I'm going to talk about here today is based on samples collected from 71 PCFG individuals. We actually have over twice as many samples from PCFG individuals collected now, but these were the ones that were analyzed for this study. So today I'll just be talking about those 71, and they are PCFG animals in the sense that they are animals that have been seen in more than 1 year on that southern feeding ground. And then to make use of those samples, we've focused on two different types of genetic markers. These are what you would call sort of traditional genetic markers. There's a lot of new technology that's allowing us to get a lot of new and more in-depth information out of a genetic sample or a biopsy sample. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our future plans, which incorporates more of the sort of omics side of things. But we did learn a lot from these more traditional markers. The first of these is the mitochondrial DNA control region. Mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited, so you get it, your mitochondrial DNA always comes only from your mother. And it's really great as a marker to study baleen whales because it basically tracks behaviors that are passed down from a mother to her offspring. So that means it's a really good marker to look at patterns of matrilineal fidelity, that behavior of mothers bringing their calves to feed in an area and then the calves returning in subsequent years and eventually bringing their own calves. And then for nuclear DNA, the work I'm talking about here today utilized 12 microsatellite loci. Nuclear DNA is biparentally inherited. It comes from both your parents, and so it can be used to look at patterns of interbreeding. And it's also useful for a wide range of other types of studies, including things like looking at relationships between individuals or creating unique genetic profiles for individuals that can be used for genetic matching. So it has a wide range of different uses. For the purposes of what I'm talking about today, we're going to use the mitochondrial DNA analyses to address questions that are more relevant to the MMPA, and the nuclear DNA analyses to address questions that are more relevant to the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so for our first question, which is MMPA related, is how many demographically independent populations of gray whales exist in the North Pacific. So this is getting at, is the rate of external recruitment into these groups greater than or less than the degree of internal recruitment. And to do this, we were looking at mitochondrial DNA haplotypes. And the first thing I wanted to show you was the haplotype diversity. And so the first point to make here is that while the Pacific Coast Feeding Group whales have a lower number of haplotypes than do the Northern Feeding Ground whales, they have quite similar values for haplotype diversity. And that's somewhat surprising because if the abundance of the Pacific Coast Feeding Group whales has been small for multiple generations, we would expect there to be perhaps a greater reduction in genetic diversity. And that is indeed what we see among the Sakhalin whales. So the mitochondrial DNA diversity found among the Sakhalin whales is fairly markedly reduced compared to the PCFG and Northern Feeding Ground whales, although the number of haplotypes found among the Sakhalin whales is pretty similar to the PCFG. And what you can see I realize this graph is very small, but if you squint at this graph in the bottom, which has the gray whale haplotypes along the x-axis and the frequency in which they're found in each of these three groups on the y-axis, you can see that there are two very tall bars that stand out on this graph, and those are the two haplotypes that are found in very high frequencies among Sakhalin whales. So almost 70% of our animals sampled off Sakhalin carry one of these two haplotypes. And then there are a handful of other haplotypes found in moderate frequencies, and then 11 haplotypes that are found only in a single individual, all of which are only found in males. And so the majority of our reproductive females in Sakhalin carry one of these two very common haplotypes. So this pattern really reflects those reproductive females bringing their calves to the area, their calves returning in subsequent years and eventually bringing their own calves back, so that over time these frequencies have really built up of these two really common haplotypes. And so next we looked at the mitochondrial DNA differences between groups, and here we can see that all three groups have statistically significant differences in mitochondrial DNA haplotype frequencies. You can see, however, that the magnitude of differentiation between the Northern Feeding Ground and the PCFG whales is almost an order of magnitude lower than what we see in the comparisons of both those groups with the Sakhalin whales. And so in general, the level of differentiation between the Northern Feeding Ground and the PCFG whales is quite low, even though it is statistically significant. And so if we kind of take a step back and look at the results so far, we can see off Sakhalin we have reduced mitochondrial DNA diversity, and at least on the scale for dip delineation, substantial mitochondrial DNA differentiation. And so that's fairly convincing evidence that the whales off Sakhalin do represent a demographically independent population. And that is consistent with other lines of evidence, including photo ID data showing that there is strong matrilineal fidelity to this area, as well as some demographic modeling that's been conducted that's shown that the level of external recruitment into the area is very low or essentially nothing over the last 10 to 15 years, at least. So the story with the Pacific Coast Feeding Group whales, though, is it's a little bit less convincing. The mitochondrial DNA diversity is similar to what we see in the Northern Feeding Group, even though that's a much, much larger group of animals. There are differences in mitochondrial DNA haplotype frequencies, but the magnitude of those differences is quite small. So that leaves us with some question as to whether the PCFG is representative of a demographically independent population. And when you kind of think about this in terms of where these feeding grounds are located, it really, it makes a lot of sense. So, all the whales that overwinter in Mexico and feed up in the Bering and Chukchi Sea, all of those whales would be crossing through the southern feeding ground on their migration north. And you can imagine that if they were maybe not in good condition or just happen to find some really good prey resources in that area, they might stop in that area and stay. And if they were successful, they could return in subsequent years. So you can see why it would be a lot easier for a whale that maybe in the past fed on the Northern Feeding Ground to one day decide to feed in the Pacific Coast feeding ground, southern feeding area, than it would be, say, for a northern feeding ground whale to travel over to Sakhalin, where they'd have to essentially bypass their usual feeding grounds and travel extra distance. But we did want to look a little bit more in depth, or try to get a little bit better answer to the question of whether or not the Pacific Coast feeding group represents a demographically independent population. So we took this one step further and used a quite different approach to try to better evaluate what the balance of immigration versus internal recruitment is within that group. And I think, at the core of this is that because some of the assumptions of estimating mitochondrial differentiation between PCFG and northern feeding group gray whales, we couldn't get a direct estimate of contemporary immigration into the PCFG just using that value. So instead, we decided to create these simulated data sets that essentially mimicked our real data sets. So in terms of numbers of samples, timing of the sampling, and so forth, and then simulated them under different levels of immigration from the northern feeding group into the PCFG. We then computed a variety of summary statistics from our simulated data and compared those the summary statistics from the simulated data to our actual empirical observed value. And so you can see just one of those summary statistics on this graph. Along the x-axis is the immigration rate in immigrants per year, and that ranges from 0 to 16 immigrants per year. And then on the y-axis is the proportion of our simulations that generated an FST value that was either higher than in yellow or lower than in green, our observed value. And so here we found that if we allowed 10 or more immigrants into the PCFG each year, then in 95% of our simulations, we would get a lower FST than what we found in our empirical study. And then the converse was that with fewer than 2 immigrants per year, we would get a higher FST than what we had observed in our study. And immigration of about 4 animals per year, which is about 2% into the PCFG, produced results that were most consistent with the empirical data. So this did give us perhaps a better idea of what rate of immigration into this group could be occurring. Although I would caution that, like with all models, the results are very specific to the model used, and they don't reflect, this model does not reflect all sources of uncertainty that exist. And it's something we're still working on and hope to do some more simulations with over the course of this next summer. So even with our simulations completed, we still didn't have a really clear answer. Approximately 4 immigrants per year into the PCFG was the best fit with our empirical data. This is probably somewhat less than what we'd expect for internal recruitment into the group, but it's not markedly less, and certainly within that range of plausibility was kind of basically a near balance between what you might think internal and external immigration would be. So it didn't really provide super convincing evidence to tip the weight over into, yes, this is definitely a dip, or no, it's definitely not a dip. We also don't get we have a lot of good data from other data sources, but it's also not very clear on this particular question. So the photo ID evidence does show that some whales demonstrate matrilineal fidelity to this area. So some whales are first identified as calves and return in subsequent years. But at the same time, there's quite a number of new non-calf animals identified in at least many of the years. And so we're not quite sure where the balance of those two things lies either. And because this was such a difficult question, several years ago, NOAA Fisheries did put together an expert task force to address the question of whether the PCFG qualifies as a stock. And that task force of experts was unable to come to resolution on the question in the end. So for now, the PCFG continues to be considered part of the Eastern North Pacific stock under the MMPA, although it is considered separately in some cases. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, they are considered a separate group for purposes of the macaw hunt management plan that's been proposed. And we do have some more ongoing work that we hope might give us a better answer to this question that I'll touch on in the end. And then I added in this bullet point, this year should be interesting, just to flag that, I mentioned in the past, there was a unusual mortality event in 1999 and 2000. And following that event, there was elevated strandings of gray whales along the coast of North America, but there was also an increase in the number of animals that began using that southern feeding ground. And some of those animals only used that southern feeding ground for 1 year, but some of them did actually return in subsequent years. So it's going to be really interesting to see if we see a similar bump in the number of new individuals using the southern feeding ground after this, during or after this current UME. Okay, so on to our next question, which relates to how many breeding populations of gray whales there are in the North Pacific. And for this question, we focused on the nuclear DNA. And here you can see measures of nuclear DNA diversity based on the 12 microsatellite loci that we had genotyped on all these samples. And I think the general take-home message here is that we saw similar measures of nuclear diversity in all 3 of our strata. So there wasn't a marked decrease in the nuclear diversity in the 2 smaller groups of animals, the PCFG and Sakhalin, when compared to that much larger northern feeding ground group of animals. We also did not see that either of the 2 small groups contained a high proportion of private alleles. And by that, I mean alleles that are found only in one group and not in the other groups. Certainly this microsatellite data set covers just a very, very small proportion of the genome, but in general, that's suggestive of the genetic diversity found in Sakhalin and in the PCFG whales being essentially a subset of what can be found among the larger northern feeding group. We then looked at the level of nuclear genetic differentiation between the 3 groups. And the first thing to note here is that there is a lack of significant differences in the microsatellite allele frequencies between the PCFG and the northern feeding ground. And that suggests that these 2 groups of animals are interbreeding and are thus likely part of the same breeding stock. When we did the same comparisons using Sakhalin, we found significant differences between Sakhalin and both the northern feeding group and the PCFG. And so that's consistent with there being a lack of random mating of Sakhalin animals with those other 2 groups. And again, this kind of makes sense when you're looking at the map, because the southern feeding ground animals overlap with those northern feeding ground animals on both their migrations and on the wintering ground. So it makes sense that when it's time to breed, they're likely going to be around other northern feeding group whales as well as other PCFG whales. And so this result actually wasn't that surprising of a finding for the Sakhalin whales either when we first identified it, which was before 2010, because at that time we thought that the whales that were off Sakhalin were a remnant of the historically hunted population in the Western North Pacific. And thus it made total sense that we would get a signal that the animals off Sakhalin were interbreeding largely with each other while they were migrating south to their Western North Pacific wintering ground versus the northern feeding group whales, which were migrating over to the coast of Mexico. So initially, these significant differences fit in with what we thought we knew about gray whales. But given what we know now of the movements of Sakhalin whales into the Eastern North Pacific, the mechanism driving this genetic differentiation is a bit more difficult to understand. These movements do suggest a couple of alternative stock structure hypotheses that are worth considering. First, it's possible that all the whales off Sakhalin Island are of Eastern origin. And by that, I mean that they or their close ancestors were born in the Eastern North Pacific, such that these whales colonized the Sakhalin feeding ground when the population of Eastern North Pacific, well, probably when the population of Eastern North Pacific whales began getting close to carrying capacity in the 80s and early 90s. So these might have been whales that weren't finding good food on those traditional northern feeding ground areas and decided to travel a little further in search of additional resources. And then, of course, the second alternative is that some of the whales off Sakhalin are of Eastern origin, and others are remnants of the gray whales that were historically hunted off of Korea. So those are 2, I think, of the most likely explanations for the whales off Sakhalin, although I would note that there are a large number of other stock structure hypotheses that have been put forward And if anyone's interested in those, they should look at some of the more recent IWC reports because there are a lot of details on that in those reports. But we do have a few more pieces of evidence that we can kind of put into this puzzle. And so first of all, early on in the work off Sakhalin, we used the microsatellite data to conduct a paternity assessment among the sampled Sakhalin whales. So between 1995 and 2007, we were able to sample 57 mother-calf pairs. And we had sampled 55 whales that we genetically identified as males and were either first identified as non-calves or were identified as calves, but known to be of reproductive age during part of the study. What we found was that we could assign a little less than half of the calves to a father that had been sampled off Sakhalin. And at first glance, that seems like a pretty high assignment rate for a cetacean study. A lot of the studies of paternity in cetaceans, because they're difficult to sample and difficult to get a lot of individuals represented, tend to have relatively low success rates. So at first, this kind of seemed pretty good. But really, when you think about the fact that we had, for this time period, we had 83% of the animals photographically identified off Sakhalin, genetically sampled. So in general, you might expect that we would have been able to assign fathers for, some 80% of those calves. And so that raised the question of, where are these missing fathers? And based on relatedness patterns of those unassigned calves, we estimated that we're looking for about 17 missing fathers. So those paternities could be accounted for by about 17 males. And so a few possibilities have been raised for where those missing fathers could be. One is that they could be animals that do feed off Sakhalin, but they just were not genetically sampled. So we did have 18 animals of unknown age or sex, which have been photographed but not sampled off Sakhalin at this time. And it's possible that, adult males have some behavioral, there's some behavioral component of being an adult male that makes it harder for them to be sampled. So they're sampled less representatively than some of the other age and sex classes. Another possibility is that the missing fathers are animals that do feed in the Western North Pacific, but they don't use Sakhalin. They use other areas, potentially Kamchatka, which is an area we know is used by some feeding gray whales. But then, of course, with the revelation that Sakhalin whales were moving across the Pacific to the wintering grounds off Mexico, the other possibility is that those missing fathers are actually whales that are part of the northern feeding group or potentially the PCFG, but part of the Eastern North Pacific stock. The second analysis that provides some insight was a genetic clustering analysis. And this analysis both determines the most likely number of genetic clusters, which is essentially populations, in the genetic data, and then assigns individuals to each of those clusters such that it's minimizing Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and linkage disequilibrium. And so we initially ran this analysis without incorporating any information on the location at which individuals were sampled. And it indicated that the most likely number of genetic clusters in our data set was 2. And so that kind of fits in with there being a Eastern North Pacific breeding stock and a Western North Pacific breeding stock. However, when we explored how our samples were assigned to these groups, the results were a little bit more complex. So here I'm showing a bar plot with individuals lined up on the x-axis, and the proportion of each individual's membership into a cluster shown on the y-axis. So the two clusters are shown in the two different colors, purple and I guess I'll call that dark blue. So you can see that the first block of samples, those are all animals that are part of the northern feeding ground. And with one exception, they all assign strongly to that purple group. So there was this one animal that has some proportion of assignment to the dark blue group. But in general, we can assume, since all these northern feeding group animals belong to the purple group, that this is kind of our eastern-like cluster. Oops. Of the animals sampled off Sakhalin, however, there's some individuals that assign strongly to the purple eastern-like cluster, and there are some individuals that assign strongly to the dark blue cluster. And so at first glance, the simplest explanation for this is that the dark blue cluster represents the Western breeding population. So potentially providing some support for this alternative hypothesis too, that some of the whales off Sakhalin are of Eastern origin, while others represent remnants of the pre-whaling Western stock. But if you look a little bit closer, it gets a little more puzzling because there are some animals that, that are mixed. So they have about, they're assigned about 50-50 or so to the purple cluster and 50% to the dark blue cluster. And so this pattern is generally interpreted as indicating admixture or interbreeding between the two groups. And if we're thinking that one of these groups, the dark blue group, is the animals breeding in the Western North Pacific, and the purple group is the animals breeding in the Eastern North Pacific, and that those that breeding is happening on migratory routes and wintering grounds, then it's kind of difficult to imagine how animals from those two groups would interbreed, because the only place they overlap is on the feeding ground. So it's not impossible to think that some degree of interbreeding on the feeding ground could occur, but it doesn't fit with kind of our general state of knowledge about where gray whales are breeding. So it didn't totally match up with that hypothesis too, that there are two groups, two separate breeding stocks of whales feeding off of Sakhalin. And then the last piece of information I'm going to talk about is the estimation of genetic effective size. And so that's roughly equivalent to the number of breeding animals in the population. And we find that the effective size of the Sakhalin group is really quite small. It's estimated to be about 80 individuals with a 95% confidence interval from 62 to 108. And that's a pretty small number. So it's generally inconsistent with Sakhalin whales demonstrating random mating with the much larger northern feeding ground population. For example, if we do the same estimation for the northern feeding group samples, the 95% confidence interval bound is essentially infinity. So we'd expect if there was random mating with northern feeding group whales, or even fairly substantial mating between Sakhalin and the northern feeding group, that number would be quite a bit higher. So that this number really suggests that the Sakhalin animals are largely interbreeding with each other. And this kind of raises the question of what we know about when and where gray whales breed. Now, the available data is admittedly somewhat outdated. It goes back to the 1960s, but it suggests that the first round of breeding in gray whales occurs in late November to early December. And then those whales that don't those females that don't get pregnant in that first round of mating may have a second ovulation when they're closer to those wintering lagoons off Mexico. The median passage date, and again, this is a little bit dated information, but the median passage date through Unimet Pass for those northern feeding group animals is 12th of December. And then we know from those 3 Sakhalin whales that were tagged, one of them stayed off Sakhalin until the 10th of December, and the other 2 stayed there until the 24th of November. So when we take all this together, it does suggest that the Sakhalin whales that are migrating to the Eastern North Pacific may be breeding when they're pretty far west on their migration and when they're largely around just each other. So before they join the major migratory stream of those northern feeding group animals that are headed south. And if so, that could be an explanation for how we're getting these patterns of suggesting that Sakhalin animals are largely interbreeding with each other, even though we know that some of them are going over to the Eastern North Pacific. So just to kind of summarize how these results fit together with these hypotheses. So alternative hypothesis 2, that some whales off Sakhalin Island are of Eastern origin, while others represent remnants of the pre-whaling Western stock. In this hypothesis, the signal of genetic differentiation that we see in the nuclear data would be driven by the whales that remain in the Western North Pacific year-round, breeding with each other. This is supported by the observations of whales off Japan and China, because we do know that there are some whales that are in the Western North Pacific during the spring and winter seasons. It's somewhat inconsistent with the estimated effective size, because you'd think if a fairly high proportion of the whales that feed off Sakhalin are migrating to the eastern North Pacific. And if the whales migrating to the eastern North Pacific are also interbreeding with northern feeding ground whales, I think you'd expect that effective size estimate to be higher and to have a broader confidence intervals. And this hypothesis also, as I mentioned, can't account for the signal of admixture that we're seeing, unless we think that there might be some interbreeding between the animals that go to the western wintering ground and the eastern wintering ground while they're on that feeding ground. So I don't think that's entirely out of the question, but it may not be the most logical explanation. So under alternative hypothesis 1, the whales off Sakhalin Island are of eastern origin, but they have recolonized the western North Pacific for feeding. The signal of genetic differentiation in this case is driven by whales that are migrating east, interbreeding largely with each other while on the westernmost part of the migration. So this would be this part is kind of essential. So this hypothesis only works if the whales off Sakhalin Island have a mechanism for breeding largely with each other. It's consistent with what's known about the timing of breeding. It is consistent, or it could be explained, can explain the pattern of admixture we see. What it doesn't explain is who the whales are off of Japan and China. So if all or most of the whales off Sakhalin are going to the eastern North Pacific, then who are these whales that remain in the western North Pacific? You know, are they animals that feed in an area other than Sakhalin? Are they just kind of stragglers? Are they recolonizing the western wintering grounds? So we really need more information on those animals. And then finally, the sort of caveat to this is that the power to detect the presence of 2 isolated breeding stocks within a sample set depends on the degree of population differentiation and the evenness with which 2 groups are sampled. So, you know, we know that the connectivity between eastern North Pacific and western North Pacific gray whales probably fluctuated in the past with, you know, with changing sea level due to ice age changes and things like that. So I think it's reasonable to expect they might not have been very strongly differentiated even in the past. And if we are only sampling a very small number of animals from that, from a remnant pre-whaling western stock, it's entirely possible that we wouldn't pick up any sort of signal in the genetic analyses we've done so far. So I think that's a pretty big caveat to evaluating all this. And then just briefly, I know I'm running out of time, but I'll talk about what we have going on next. We have a genetic analysis of relatedness to identify mother-offspring pairs that's underway. And the goal of this is a little bit different depending on the group of animals. So for the Pacific Coast feeding group, the goal of this is to increase our understanding of the extent of internal recruitment. So if we have an animal that we first photographed off the southern feeding ground as a non-calf, and we don't know if it's an external recruit, an animal that used to feed in the northern feeding ground, or if it could be an animal that is the offspring of a PCFG mom but was not identified with that mom as a calf. And this type of analysis is going to allow us to categorize that animal into, could potentially allow us to identify that animal as an internal recruit versus an external recruit, if we're able to identify a PCFG mom as part of that pair. And then in Sakhalin, this analysis has a little bit of a different bent and is based on the assumption that fidelity to wintering grounds is inherited or passed along from your mother. And so in this case, we're going to try and identify mother-offspring pairs. And if either the mother or the offspring has been sighted in the eastern North Pacific, we think it's reasonable to assume that it's, or at least likely that that animal's calves have also gone to the eastern North Pacific. So this might allow us to sort of expand our understanding of what proportion of the whales off Sakhalin migrate to the east. And then we, this fall, are going to be starting an epigenetic analysis of aging that's going to be interesting for a number of reasons, but will allow us to identify which of those mother-offspring pairs, which of the animals is the mother and which is the offspring, which is going to particularly add some power to our analysis of the PCFG recruitment. And then we have a pilot study that will be starting to evaluate temporal and geographic differences in microbiome signatures. And that's going to start this fall as well. And that's all I have. I'm happy to take any questions. I realize I went a little over time, I think, but hopefully some people can maybe stick around.
Hello, Aimée. That was great. Thank you. We do have a number of questions in the chat, and I'll pose them to you so you can see them. Let me just pull this up here. We have one question from from Daniel Palacios. What is the genetic makeup of flex, barbara, and other Sakhalin animals that migrate to the eastern northern Pacific? And is it consistent with the eastern northern Pacific animals?
So that's a really great question. And I can't recall specifically flex and barbara, but I can say that, of the animals that we have identified as migrating between Sakhalin and the eastern North Pacific, some of them have, within that clustering analysis, some of them fall into the group that is more similar to the eastern North Pacific animals, and some of them fall into the group that, the separate group that potentially is more like a western North Pacific. So it's kind of a mixed pattern. We have animals that fall in both those groups that we know have gone over to Mexico. So I think hopefully that answers your question there, although it doesn't provide really good insight to what's going on.
He says, thank you for the nice presentation, Aimée. Great detective work looking at many lines of evidence to put this picture together. Lori, looks like I think Lori Whitecamp is asking a question. Any chance there are whale bones or other tissues that have DNA from historic WFC whales to compare to current samples?
Yeah, another a great idea, and we've been trying to follow up on that, both the possibility of whale bones from historic samples, as well as there's a small handful of samples, contemporary samples from the Japanese animals. But in particular, we haven't had much luck. There's not a lot of whale bones from Western North Pacific animals, or baleen for that matter, that exists. And we haven't had much luck in getting it over to the US or where we could analyze it. We did get a piece of baleen a few years ago from a university, or I think it was a museum in Tokyo, that had been collected off Korea in 1914. Unfortunately, we did bring it over to our lab, but we were only able to get a partial mitochondrial sequence from it, and it was not, it was a sequence that, at least this partial sequence, was a sequence that has been found in both the Eastern North Pacific and the Western North Pacific, so it wasn't that informative. But that is something that's on our radar, and if we're able to find a way to get more of those samples, we're definitely going to try and pursue that.
Thank you. Another question from Lee Torres. What is the sex ratio of whales in Sakhalin? Is it 50-50? And if not, how would that affect your paternity results? I guess I'm wondering if male gray whales roam more than females and could be the cause of this genetic mixing.
So among the Sakhalin animals, the ones that have been identified initially as non-calves are roughly 50-50 male versus female. Of the animals that we first identified as calves being brought to the area, there's actually it's not significant, but somewhat of a male bias. So there's roughly 66% of those are males. So I don't think that's affecting our paternity results directly. One thing that could, though, perhaps, that's sort of getting at the same question, I think, is that within the Sakhalin feeding ground, the sort of the best food is right off of our study area, and that's often where we see the mothers and the calves. So we may have more of those sampled, and may have slightly, may have more difficulty sampling some of the animals that feed a little bit further offshore. It's possible that some of those could be males, but I think in general among our adult population, it's roughly 50-50.
We have another comment from Bruce May. The comment is, he understands you see new whales in the WGW region each year that are not calves. And there have been sightings of up to 5 WGW Western gray whales in a small area of British Columbia, suggesting that they may stay together even during the migration. And I think that's kind of a comment question.
Yeah, so I'll take the first part first. There are whales that are seen off Sakhalin each year that are non-calves, that are not identified as calves. It's usually a fairly small number in most years, and we think that in a lot of years, those are probably animals that we just missed as calves, so we didn't manage to get a photograph or a genetic sample of those animals when they were a calf off Sakhalin. And some of that is based on the demographic modeling work that Justin Cook has done that has shown that there's very little external recruitment into that feeding group. So most of the new animals, based on his model, most of the new animals are likely to be internal recruits. They just happen to not have been identified and photographed when they were calves. And then for the comment about the sightings of up to 5 western gray whales in a small area off British Columbia, suggesting they may stay together during migration. Yeah, I think that is a really interesting observation that was published in a paper several years ago. And since that time, there's been other cases where, for example, I know we were able to genetically match an animal that was sampled in the Eastern North Pacific on the migratory route. We were able to genetically match it to a Sakhalin animal. And then when I went back and asked that the rest of the photographs from the rest of the group be examined, they found another Sakhalin animal in that group. So I think this is a real thing that they are staying together during migration. It also could feed into this hypothesis that, maybe that also plays a role in the Sakhalin whales having more access to each other when they're ready to mate. But mostly it's just really interesting what sort of mechanism they would use and why they would do that. But it's one of those fascinating parts of gray whale biology.
Another question from Scott Baker. Thanks, Aimée. What about the origin of the gray whale off Namibia? And are we sure the Atlantic population is extinct?
Let's see. In terms of the origin of the gray whale off Namibia, I do think, and this is referencing a very recently published paper. I think it maybe even just came out in the last couple of days, where they were able to get a genetic sample from a whale that had gray whale that had managed to somehow get all the way down to Namibia, and was in pretty poor condition. Probably did not survive, but in terms of the origin, based on the results in that paper, I do feel like they're correct in saying that the likely origin of that whale is the North Pacific. I wasn't as convinced as the paper suggests that the whale might have been an animal that fed off Sakhalin. I think that's a little bit more nebulous of a conclusion, but I do think it was probably a whale from the North Pacific. It makes sense that those events are going to happen as the ice changes up in the Arctic, and gray whales that are going to feed further and further north, and then it's time to migrate, and maybe they're too far north and go south the wrong way. I mean, it's we're not going to know exactly what route that animal took, but it's certainly fascinating. And it's not the first time, Scott is aware of this, but for others in the audience, there was another whale seen off in the Mediterranean a few years before this Namibian whale that was also thought potentially to have come from the North Pacific. And then more recently, there's been a whale in really bad condition that's been sighted several times off Spain and in that area. So we don't have any information on what the origin of that last whale is. They did collect some genetic material, so we'll see if we get more information in the future. But I think it's a pretty good bet the Atlantic population is extinct, but gray whales keep surprising us, Scott. So who knows? We could come up with something in the future, but yeah, I think it's probably extinct, and these are probably North Pacific whales.
Thanks. Thanks for those answers. Angie Shremba has asked, what were the mitochondrial DNA haplotypes of the admixed individuals?
Oh yeah, good question, Angie. And they were pretty the composition, the mitochondrial DNA haplotype composition of the admixed individuals was pretty similar to the Sakhalin group as a whole. So most of them had one of those 2 common haplotypes. There were a couple that had more unique haplotypes, but most of them were those 2 common haplotypes. So it didn't really provide any more information about kind of their genetic genetic background, I guess I'd say.
We have a follow-up question from Bruce Mate, which is, are the Sakhalin whales arriving later and thus contributing with the other two commented groups to them keeping their genes more to themselves? Yeah.
I think that's a really good question. I don't think we have an answer to that. I think they're certainly coming from farther away. It would make sense that they're going to be arriving later. But as far as I know, no one's looked at that, and that might be something that could be investigated with photographs, but I'm not sure, how those photographs are collected over the season in Mexico. But it's a good point that it seems likely that it seems reasonable to me that they would be arriving later, but yeah, we don't know for sure.
Timing. All right, another question from Lori Whitecamp. Has anyone studied whale associations in Mexico? And do they stay together then, especially if there may be a second mating season?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And to my knowledge, no one has looked at the whale associations in the lagoons in Mexico. I do think, however, that would be possible. They have, really extensive photo ID catalogs down there. And so maybe that's something we should bring up to our colleagues in Mexico to see if that's something they thought about or might be feasible to do. One of the issues down there is just that there's so many animals that use that area. It takes a lot more effort to study things like associations when you're working with such a large number of animals. But yeah, it's definitely something we can bring up to some of our colleagues working in Mexico and see if either they've started doing something like that or if they would consider doing it in the future.
Great. Thank you. I think that concludes all of our questions. Very nice job from Bruce Mate, and I'm sure the rest of the folks online are also really appreciative of your presentation today. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy I could present here, and I hope I'll be back one day in person.
We do too. All right, thank you everyone. That concludes our seminar today. This is recorded and it will be uploaded to our website as well as on our YouTube page. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Amy. It was really fun to hear your whole seminar. Appreciate
well, you've heard most of it before, Bruce, but I'm glad you could make it.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good to see you, Bruce.
Yeah, good to see you too, Yi-Chung.
All right, Angie.
Thank you.
You got a puppy, huh?
Yeah, very loud.